Hi, I'm Jennifer Ponce de León. I'm the Associate Director of the Critical Theory Workshop. And today we are celebrating John Bellamy Foster's newest book, Breaking the Bonds of Fate, Epicurus and Marx, which was just published by Monthly Review Press. Now, before introducing our speakers and beginning our event, I just want to make a few announcements about the Critical Theory Workshop's upcoming activities. We are currently accepting applications for our 18th annual summer school, which will be held next July, both online and in person in Paris. I direct this workshop along with Gabriel Rockhill. In addition to presenting our own work, we will be joined by Cedric Johnson, Max Isle, and Helen Yaffe. And we'll drop more information about that in the chat. We are also accepting applications for a 6-week online course on imperialism, underdevelopment, and rational planning, which will begin in January. And it will be taught by Jared Bly and will feature many guest speakers, including Emmanuel Ness, Ziad El-Nabolsi, and myself. And finally, please stay tuned for an online discussion of Gabriel Rockhill's latest book, Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism, which was just published by Monthly Review Press. That will take place next Thursday, December 11th at this same time, noon Eastern Daylight Time. And in addition to Gabriel, John Bellamy Foster and Ali Kadri will be joining to discuss the book. Okay, now to get to our event for today. So I'm very thrilled that we have John Bellamy Foster with us today. He is a world-renowned scholar and the editor of Monthly Review. He has published widely on political economy and is internationally celebrated as an environmental sociologist. He is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the University of Oregon. And Breaking the Bonds of Fate is a path-breaking study of the long-term impact of Epicureanism on Marxist thought, which clarifies Marx's relation to materialism and ecology, as well as his analysis of freedom and necessity. It is the final book to be published in a trilogy of books that Dr. Foster has written, and this includes his book, Marx's Ecology, Materialism, and Nature, which was published in 2000, and his 2020 book, Return of Nature, Socialism and Ecology, which won the Deutscher Memorial Prize. Now, we are also very lucky to have two other guests with us today who are going to comment on Breaking the Bonds of Fate. Boris Hennig is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Toronto Metropolitan University. And Paul Schafer is also with us, and he is a professor in the philosophy department at Xavier University of Louisiana. So we're going to start with hearing from John, and then we're going to have comments from Boris and Paul. Then John will respond, and then at that point, if there are comments from the listeners, we can turn to those. Okay, thank you so much, John. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, it's wonderful to be here, and I'd like to thank the Critical Theory Workshop for organizing this book launch. For me, this book, Breaking the Bonds of Fate, Epicurus and Marx, is the product of a 25-year journey. And it really started with my book, Marx's Ecology. Now, the year before, I had written an article on Marx's theory of metabolic rift for the American Journal of Sociology. And having done that, I wondered, well, how did Marx manage to come up with this very powerful theory of ecological crisis? And he couldn't really make bricks without straw any more than anyone else, genius though he was. So I started to think about this, and the answer was, of course, Marx's materialism. But what did Marx's materialism represent? For most Marxists, Marx's materialism had to do with his economics. But because economics was seen as a completely social element, divorced from the material world in the sense of nature, divorced from the foundations of material reality, it was easy to see his economics almost in idealistic terms. And there had been a long history of Marxism abandoning Marx's materialism, replacing it with idealistic views or converting his materialism into something that was effectively idealist in character, and asking the question what Marx's materialism really was and how this related to his ecological conceptions was then a very foundational, radical question. And it meant going to the roots. And so I went back in Marx's ecology to Marx's doctoral dissertation on Epicurus and its relation to the rest of his thought. Traditionally, Marx's, well, not traditionally, but most recently in Western Marxist thought, the doctoral dissertation had been interpreted as Hegelian, and Epicurus as an idealist, and Marx as an idealist at that time. And although there was a lot written on the subject, almost all of it was completely ignorant of what Marx was doing, because they had no knowledge whatsoever of his encounter with Epicureanism. They didn't understand who Epicurus was and didn't even bother to read it, to study Epicurean thought. So the interpretations were all upside down. But my object was to uncover what Marxist materialism was, and so I started with the doctoral dissertation on Epicurus and went right through his thought in Marx's ecology. Unfortunately, in a way, it was chapter 5 on the metabolic rift, which was the only thing people read. And they ignored the whole argument on ecological materialism in the book. And of course, the metabolic rift was an important concept. And there were two basic criticisms of the book. One was that Marx's ecological conceptions hadn't had any impact on socialist or other thought subsequently. And the other one was that this was just based on a few fragments here and there and had no meaning or coherence. So I had to address the first problem, the fact that it didn't have any impact. And I spent 20 years off and on working on that. And the result was The Return of Nature, where I explained the development of ecological thought and how socialists had actually been at the front end of the development of ecological thought from the very beginning, and that Marx's analysis had been important. And in fact, Marx's approach in terms of metabolism is really the basis of all the Earth system analysis to the present day. Not that it all comes directly from Marx, but it's all in line with what he was developing at the time. So I explained that on Return of Nature, and after 20 years, after publishing that, I was free to deal with the other problem. And the Marxist ecology was all about ecological materialism. And the roots of that, I believed, as I argued in Marxist ecology, were to be found in Marx's original encounter with Epicurus, to some extent Aristotle, but Epicurus was key. So I finally got invited to give some talks on Epicurus and Marx, and then I decided, well, I better write that book. And so the whole thing became a trilogy on ecological Marxism. The last part to be written was Breaking the Bonds of Fate. And in a way, it's the first in logical order, the last that was written chronologically. And it's really important to understand how significant this is, in the sense that we really can't build on the foundations of Marx's thought or even understand fully what it constituted without uncovering his materialism and maybe returning to what others understood about that earlier on. And you may know that, in volume one of Capital in the postface or the last preface, Marx at the end talks about Hegel, and he says he's going to stand Hegel on his feet because Hegel's been trying to walk through history and on his head. That's not literally how he said it, but that's the significance. But Marx was not just originating that. That came from the Epicurean tradition. It came from Epicurus and Lucretius. So Lucretius, in criticizing the idealists and the skeptics, in particular of his time, said they have stood where well, is referring to a particular skeptic. He says, has stood with his own head where his feet belong. And that's the connection. Marx understood the significance of this deep materialism, and finding that and going back to it is important. So this is a project in ecological materialism as a whole, but with Epicurus at the roots. And the book is called Breaking the Bonds of Fate, because that was a phrase that came out of Epicurus that Lucretius used, really in complimenting Epicurus, saying that Epicurus broke the bonds of fate, that is, fatalism, determinism, teleology, and so on. And Marx used that phrase over and over a number of times in his doctoral dissertation and his notebooks to Epicurean philosophy. So this was, this is really what inspired me initially. But as I studied Epicurus, and I really studied it for about 25 years off and on, I realized that Epicurus was a thinker of the stature of Marx himself. That Epicurean philosophy was the most influential philosophy in the ancient world in terms of numbers of adherents and the spread of the philosophy and its duration. The school lasted for intact, well, more or less for 7 centuries. There were active Epicurean scholars, which was quite extraordinary. And it spread west to Rome and east to Persia, and it was fundamental to the Hellenistic world. So, and Epicurus had this enormous stature and adherence, and it was seen in ancient times as a plebeian philosophy, as a philosophy that was aimed at ordinary people and lower class, and that's significant too. I studied in graduate school in Toronto at York University for 2 years under Ellen Masons Wood and Neil Wood. Well, I studied ancient philosophy with them during those 2 years. And one of the things that they were doing at that time that I was part of the discussions of was they were writing their class ideology and ancient political theory. And I learned 2 things at that time. One was that the philosophies of the demos and the more materialist philosophies were, which of course were so important, say, in Athens, because Athens developed a democracy of a kind, and that they basically disappeared, were not preserved, and were not picked up on. While the aristocratic philosophies, say Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, survived. And this this had to, I mean, there are a lot of factors involved in that, but one thing had to do with, philosophers have tended to be allied with aristocrats in the upper classes, and those philosophies and those works got preference. So that was one thing. Where was the philosophy of the demos? We looked at Protagoras, right, and who was attacked by Plato, but Protagoras was actually closer to the demos, and so were the sophists, who and but so I learned that. But another thing I learned from the methodology that Neil and Ellen Wood used was that what you had to do was go back in a historical material sense and construct the material conditions, lives, historical environment of these thinkers if you really wanted to know them, which is understand what was going on, which is something that philosophers very seldom do. They simply take philosophy as though it comes out of the air, right? So, going back, and if you want to understand Epicurus, you had to understand who Epicurus was and in the context of his time. So the first chapter of the book is focused on the historical context before I even get to Epicurus's philosophy. But putting the historical context there makes all the difference in terms of understanding what this was all about. So without belaboring that, we can talk about it. But I came to the conclusion that Marx had penetrated to the essence of Epicurus, and that Epicurus offered clues to the essence of Marx, and that putting them together could transform how we look at the development of Marx's thoughts. One of Marx's arguments in his notebooks on Epicurean philosophy, which are generally ignored but are very, very important, in fact, have a larger breadth than the dissertation. He said that the whole of Epicurean philosophy swerves away from the premises. Of course, most of you probably, if you've looked at this at all, know that Epicurus is famous for the swerve, right? Which breaks determinism. But Marx said, Epicurus started with assumptions that Democritus and others had, and in terms of atomism and so on. But then he turned it all upside down, and in some ways, he changed the emphasis. He swerved away from the determinism. He swerved away from all determinism, all mechanism, all fatalism, and without abandoning causality. His object was to find room for human freedom, and to do this in a context that took account of the natural world and human social relations, and even anthropology and history. As Marx said, Epicurus's notion of pleasure swerves from pain. His notion of accident swerves from determinism. He swerves from teleology, and he swerves God away from the world. So everything he broke the bonds of fate, and this is what's crucial for Marx. Now, Marx's dissertation was never published in his lifetime, and we didn't even have the entire thing. And the view of Epicurus in Marx's lifetime was that Epicurus was just a minor thinker. Well, this is complicated, because Epicurean philosophy affected the Renaissance and the development of natural science fundamentally. All the major thinkers, all the major natural scientists, and any philosopher that had any connection to empiricism was influenced by by Epicurean thought. But in philosophy, by the 19th century in Germany and so on, Epicurus had been demoted to a minor figure, and Democritus was the real important materialist. Well, of course, Marx had switched that around, but nobody read his dissertation, and the criticisms of Epicurus became more and more severe in his lifetime, and they thought that Swerve was completely irrational, and so in 1892. Engels met with a young Russian, Alexei Vodin, and asked, who was a great, he was 23 years old, but he was a classical scholar. And Engels, talked to Vodin about Marx's dissertation, which Engels said showed that Marx had never, it had always been independent of Hegel and never been a strict Hegelian. And he wanted Vodin to see if there was any analysis that bore out Marx's ideas. I don't think Vodin ever replied to Marx on it, but he spent a great deal of the rest of his life investigating the issue, and he was the principal person for editing the doctoral dissertation in the collected works, really at the end of Vodin's life. And but if Vodin had looked at the work of Theodor Gompers, he looked at everything else. But if he looked at work of Theodor Gompers, he would have been surprised. Theodor Gompers in 1862 went, well, the story is that Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii in the Herculaneum in AD 79 AD. And there was in the Herculaneum an ancient library, the only ancient library to survive, which was an Epicurean library. And at the beginning of the 19th century, they were trying to unroll, well, the papyri, the books were carbonized. They looked like lumps of coal, but they discovered they were ancient books, and they tried to come up with contraptions to unroll them. And they finally did, after destroying a lot of them, come up with some crude contraptions to do it. And the Prince of Wales sent John Hayter to Italy to have people copy them, and they did copy some of them, and then they were placed in the Bodleian Library and lost for 50 years. And Gompertz arrived in the library and was looking for these copies, which would be, of the papyri. And finally, when he was about to leave after an extended period, they found a little key that was labeled Herculaneum papyri. And so they searched every part of the library, attics and so on. They found a little chest eventually hidden away somewhere, and the key fit it. And here were these copies of the papyri. Most of the papyri that are unrolled don't survive, but these were the best copies of what turned out to be book 25 of On Nature, which is all about the concept of freedom and the development. It's a philosophy of mind, the development of mind, and how people can be free despite determinism. They can escape determinism. I won't go into it all now. We can talk about it if we want, but this verified what Marx had discovered in Epicurus's dissertation, and even extended it. I mean, even at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1920, Cyrus Bailey said, well, Marx in analyzing, and they published Marx's dissertation, and Cyrus Bailey, the leading English Epicurean scholar, said Marx was, like a century ahead of us, or most of a century ahead. And more and more, the Epicurean scholarship, particularly since the mid 20th century, since the 1960s, they began to explore Book 25 on nature and its implications, the fragments that they had, and Marx's analysis of the swerve of the whole systematic analysis in Epicurus, the connection between nature and society, um, between determination and human freedom, and all of that has come to the fore. Now, there were great Epicurean scholars in the 1930s and 40s, like Benjamin Farrington and George Thompson, who were Marxists, and they were also the leading scholars on Epicurean philosophy, and they had drawn out a whole lot of this, and Epicurean philosophy had influenced the Soviet philosophy in its early years. It influenced a lot of Marxism, but all of this was forgotten with Western Marxism because Western Marxism wasn't interested in materialism. In fact, Lenin had said that Epicurus was the originator of dialectical materialism, and that was not very welcomed by Western Marxism. But as Marx said, Epicurus's thought had had an immanent dialectic. And one of the things that makes this is so interesting is because Marx got a concept of emergence, which is central to dialectics and ecology from Epicurus. There was suddenly materialism and freedom were not opposed to each other. They could be seen as related. He saw Epicurus as the first to understand alienation and so on. And the Epicurean philosophy also involved the garden, the Epicurean community, which brought women and slaves into philosophy, which was very, very egalitarian, a society based on friendship as the ultimate principle, sustainability, all sorts of things that are important to us now. And I think that the return of the garden is a very important return of the garden, that is the garden of Epicurus. A return to that, at least, is very important in reconstructing Marxist theory when we're trying to move away from simple productivism and focus on issues of sustainability and human freedom and equality to an even greater extent. So I think that what we have here is a whole different materialist view of the development of Marxism. It's not that Hegel wasn't important, and Marx approached some of this through Hegelian lens, but Marx was fundamentally struggling with Hegel via Epicurus because Marx was already, struggling with materialism. We usually say he became a materialist in 1842, but his materialism is evident in 1841 in his doctoral thesis. So I hope I didn't go on too long, but at least this sort of gives you the outline of what I'm thinking about and the structure of it all.
Thank you so much, John. Now we'll turn to Boris for some comments.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed the book. John has sent me like 3 books by now about Epicurus and Marx, and I like tore the other two to shreds. Like one of them, I wrote a review that we decided we wouldn't publish at all because it was too negative. So he knew what he was getting into. But this book actually like that survives. Like it's a good book. Even like it has many, many very good qualities. If I like, usually when I like a book, so when I don't like a book, I criticize it. But when I like a book, I also tend to criticize it. So I will make a couple of critical remarks, but that does not mean that there was anything that I really didn't like. It's more like it raises questions, and it's good of a book to raise questions. And I want to hear more about some things, and that's also good about a book. If you want to read more of the same stuff, that's yeah. So I have 2 main things, and I'll try to make this short because I guess we are behind schedule a bit. One of them is, I think, sometimes the evidence that Epicurus was like the first to do something or the hero of the story and so on is a bit too thin. So like sometimes like I think John tends to over eulogize Epicurus. Like he says like he invented a new method of pedagogy. Like I don't really see the reasons behind that. But those are really minor details, and I will actually skip most of that. The other point is about the swerve, actually, where it's also really a minor idea that I have. And I see the counter evidence to my own idea here. But I think it's really, yeah, well, I'll say more about that, but I have a suggestion about the swerve. Um, so more, like first about the like this the eulogizing and the making Epicurus important. It's in a like with all the history of neglecting Epicurus and not finding him important enough, it is of course very important to point at everything that makes Epicurus much more important than what people thought. But I never like, or I think it's always a bad idea to exaggerate, even if you're on the right side. Like exaggeration, yeah, takes basically everything out of your arguments. And I'm just yeah, I'm wondering whether there might be some exaggeration going on here. I stick to the topic of freedom, for instance. John says at one point that Epicurus initiated the millennia-long struggle for freedom, and that he was is widely acknowledged to be the first ancient philosopher to actually pose the question of determinism. And he refers to a paper by Sedley, where Sedley says, well, arguably. Epicurus was the first one to put that question at the center. And that's a very different statement. Like it's so I don't see in Sedley's paper this idea that Epicurus was the first one to raise the question. I'm pretty sure that John has read more about Epicurus than I. So maybe there is something that can like support that idea that actually Epicurus is like does something that where he is the first here. Um, the second, maybe more important point is um, I see that Epicurus, in some sense, defends the possibility of human freedom. Maybe he doesn't even defend it, I get to that later, but he definitely asserts it. He says humans are free. They are not bound by the bounds of fate. What I don't see is how that is initiating the millennia long struggle for freedom. Because I think the possibility of freedom and the struggle for freedom are really strictly like logically independent. Of course, I could have a lot of metaphysical freedom, like it could be possible for me to make my own choices, but if people actually prevent me from acting or even prevent me from making those choices, the possibility will not help me in my struggle for freedom. So the struggle for freedom is something much more ambitious than just fighting for the mere possibility of freedom. But I think it's even true the other way around. We can read a book, for instance, a novel, where we can recognize something as a struggle for freedom that the characters in the book undergo, even though we know they are not actually free because the book has been written already. Like they are not going to make any choices, any real choices in the pages we are going to read, because the author has written all of that. So the character in a book has no metaphysical freedom. They cannot actually choose anything, but we can recognize their struggle for freedom as such. So the struggle for freedom is possible even if freedom is impossible in a sense. So I think these are very different things. And what I see in Epicurus is really, and again, like John knows more about the background, the garden, and like the actual things that Epicurus did and initiated. But what I see in the philosophy, as far as we have it, is just an assertion of this metaphysical freedom, of the possibility that we might make a choice. And that's I think a lot. On the face of it, it's a lot less political, like less Marxist in a way. Um, I guess I should get to like this work, like the more like the second point here. Um, so the swerve is important as far as I understand it for Epicurus and Lucretius because, like, for two reasons. One of them is they think that atoms all fall like in straight lines. Um, yeah, and they fall all downwards in straight lines at the same speed. And if that's the only assumption we make about the movement of atoms, no two atoms can ever collide because like they do not move diagonally. So they will not bump into one another. So we need explanation. You need an explanation why they would have started bumping into one another and somehow clustering, and like how complexity comes about. And that's what the swerve like is supposed to explain. So Epicurus or Lucretius, like we only know that really in Lucretius' voice. But he says, well, the atoms swerve, they bump into one another, some of them get held up by that, and so on. So things start like colliding and also solidifying, and like that's supposed to explain physics. The more interesting bit is, of course, when then Lucretius says, or makes a connection between that collision of the atoms that he seems to happen spontaneously and human freedom, where he says, how would human freedom be possible if the atom couldn't like just swerve and do something on its own? Um, and the unhelpful version that I think neither Marx defends nor John nor anyone else who like has a good sense of what one should say here is to say humans are free because there are these random events that make them do random things. Like that's obviously not what human freedom should be. It also doesn't fit the Marxist idea of freedom, I think. When Engels or Marx talk about freedom, they say more like things like freedom is if we recognize the laws by which we are governed and we can kind of deal with that. We can react to the laws that actually make us like actually determine our actions. So freedom is not randomness. Um, and I think that's where Marx might really be ahead of his time, like at least in his reading of Epicurus. But also because John makes a lot of effort of saying Marx is not nearly as Hegelian at that point as we think. I think what Marx sees in Epicurus is actually something that comes out of his Hegelianism at the time. So Marx says so the movement of the atoms where they fall in straight lines and never collide with one another, that's a movement according to the laws of physics. So in that sense, it's heteronymous. The atoms are made to move in that way by something that lies outside of their nature, namely by a natural law. Like that's how we today think of natural laws. Like they determine things from the outside. And then Marx says the swerve is not actually really like a random hiccup where they just do something um, for no reason whatsoever, but the swerve is when the atoms act autonomously, when they act not according to the external law of nature, but according to their own internal law of motion. I don't see that anywhere in Epicurus. It must come out of Hegel, and it fits in a sense because it also would explain how the autonomous movement of the atom, that is somehow related to human freedom, because according to Kant, Hegel, and I suppose Marx as well, human freedom is really autonomy. It's like the ability to give oneself one's own laws or one's own plans, like to make plans for oneself and act according to them. Um, and that's basically what the atom is doing. But now, like my suggestion about that, and I think there's some counter evidence. So Lucretius sometimes says, if the atoms wouldn't swerve, how would human freedom be possible? And human freedom is possible because the atom swerves and so on. That sounds like this, like the first account that I sketched that says freedom is possible because there's something random happening at the molecular, like the atomic level. Um, but I think if you look at the structure of Lucretius' argument, it's more like he says, well, the atoms move in straight lines. We can't explain collision. So now we say they swerve. And that seems like an ad hoc thing that he's just introducing. Like we just assuming that atoms like swerve and then they collide and then our theory is fixed. And now in order to explain why he's justified to assume that atoms swerve, why that's not just an arbitrary ad hoc fix, for that, he turns to humans and racehorses and says, well, we see in animals and humans that they act according to their own volition, that they are autonomous in a certain way. So if that's true, if humans can be autonomous, why shouldn't atoms also be able to be autonomous? So I think what Lucretius is really doing is not to say we know that humans can be free because we know that the atoms swerve. He says like the opposite. He says, well, humans are free. We know that already. Like that's given. And because we know that, there is no good reason for then saying atoms cannot be free because like yeah, we can acknowledge freedom for humans, and therefore we might as well also assume that atoms not they are not free in a literal sense, they are not autonomous in a literal sense, But the swerve is explained by reference to human freedom. And it's not that human freedom is explained by reference to the swerve. If that's true, it might have implications for like the materialism, the determinism, and so on, and also for Epicurus' thought about freedom. Because my hunch would be that Epicurus just appeals to a fact that is known to everybody, that humans are free, and that he takes that as given, and he doesn't need to defend that. He doesn't think he needs to defend that. Um, and he might also say, or like, if he is a materialist in any way, he cannot be at the same time a determinist because like he just takes it for granted that humans are free, and if humans are somehow like reducible to matter, then he has to acknowledge certain things about matter, like which is like what Marx also points out in the Feuerbach thesis. Like, if we want to be materialists, we need a better conception of matter than just inert stuff. And matter needs to have its own principle of motion. And I think that's what Lucretius is doing. He's correcting our conception of atoms and of matter on the basis actually of his acknowledgement already of freedom. Okay, but that's like after saying all of that, I think like the book is like the highlights in the book are really like the historical richness, and like as John pointed out, it's especially important to get the history right if you want to have a Marxist view on like philosophy. That's really excellent. Like I've never seen a book with so much information about Epicurus and also about the history after, like the readers of Marx and Epicurus's PhD thesis and so on. It's a very rich book. Yeah, and I can only recommend that. If anyone asked me what book should I read about Marx and Epicurus, I would have no like hesitation, no doubt to say like that's actually the only one, the only book that you should read. The others you have to be careful with, but not this one. Okay.
Well, it's really a joy to be doing this with you, and I think if anybody had asked me, well, who should write a book on Epicurus and Marx, prior to my writing it, I would have said, well, maybe Boris Hennig could write this book because he's really the best person in terms of background and knowledge and perception. So, but a lot, you have your own. We have our own driving forces, and I was compelled to write this book. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I was the best person to write it, but I'm not saying that that I'm backing off from my analysis or agreeing with everything that Boris says here. But I'm just saying it's just wonderful to have that kind of criticism and somebody with that kind of knowledge assess what you're doing. And let me just respond to the questions, which the questions were kind of broad. But the first thing is, the exaggeration. Yeah, maybe there is some exaggeration in places, or at least it would be possible to claim that. Usually when I make a statement, I back it up. Sometimes it's actually based on somebody else's analysis, or there's usually some reason. But in terms of Epicurus and freedom, I mean, obviously it's not first to talk about freedom. I mean, Aristotle talks about freedom and equality and the Nicomachean Ethics, but I think that one gap in my book is that I've come to the conclusion that Epicurus has a notion of the social individual, which is quite unique, and that this also impacted Marx. I don't bring that out as fully in the book as I would now, but in terms of the whole question of freedom and whether Epicurus was involved in that struggle, as well as, presenting metaphysical doctrines, I think that the historical context is really important. I argue that there's a kind of praxis in what Epicurus is doing, and that really becomes the central question. It's not the revolutionary praxis of 19th century Marxism, but one of the things I was trying to explain with the historical analysis and put it together with the philosophical analysis is that Epicurus was actually trying to find practical solutions, a kind of political praxis at the time that the ancient polis was collapsing, had collapsed really. And in a time, where monarchy had come back, where the Diadochi were involved, the successors of Alexander were involved in incessant warfare. And Epicurus offered solutions in terms of community and sustainability and an ethic of freedom and even reaching out to other people and cultures. That was a kind of political practice. And in fact, we know that at least on one occasion, there was a major Epicurean revolt against a dictator. So I try to emphasize that this was a kind of political praxis in a period of the decline of the Athenian Empire, the decline of the polis, and so on. And when you put that together with the philosophy, you can see it as a struggle for freedom. And I guess so that was my thinking. And if one reads the book and you can look at that. Obviously, I'm working on that myself. I was influenced by Benjamin Farrington's analysis of this. And in terms of the other question, the on the swerve, I think that the problem is in Democritus, actually, you don't have atoms falling in a straight line. So what Epicurus introduced was both the following in the straight line and the swerve. So you have a kind of determinist movement coupled with a contingent movement. I like the term contingency rather, and it's not random. It's not like throwing a dice even. It's contingency, not a random movement. And so, what he's working with is, how do you explain the world that has a certain determinism, a certain determinacy, a certain causality, but also room for freedom, both in the natural sphere and also in the human sphere. And I think, from Marx, having, we often say even philosophy today that that the problem of materialism, it had no agency, no room for agency, and no room for freedom, that was confined to idealism. And Marx is reading Epicurus and he's saying, yeah, there's human freedom there, even a kind of praxis, and what he called an immanent dialectic. And that inspired a lot of his own thinking, which, how do I, break away from determinism mechanism and from Hegelian idealism. So I think that that's the way I would approach these things. I think that, most of what we have on the swerve, of course, is Lucretius. But it really comes from Epicurus, and we have a dozen other sources with minor allusions to it. Maybe the most important in a way is Carneades, who argued that the swerve didn't determine all human volition; it just made it possible. And so I almost feel like in response to your criticisms, maybe I would like to address those things more. Maybe I will even more, but those are my answers. And I would love it if I could see you working in this area more, Boris. And I also think that one of the gaps in the book is that I deal with a little bit, but there is, we found that Aristotle influenced Epicurus to some extent. At first, it was believed that wasn't true because we thought Epicurus only had the early exoteric writings and not the esoteric ones, but we know that now that there was more of a relationship between Aristotle and Epicurus than we thought. And Aristotle in his more biological writings comes out more on a materialist end. And Marx was looking at that too. So if I were to delve in the ancient philosophy more, and you would be better able to do this than me, I would look, and in fact, I have tried to look at the Aristotle Epicurus Marx connection.
I will look into that.
Wonderful, thank you. So now we'll go ahead and turn to Paul. You're muted. Let's see.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a wonderful discussion. What I would like to do is sort of two things. To first talk about why I like this book, which I really did like this book. I learned a lot from it. I would echo many of the things that Boris said. And there are three different reasons that I want to pull out about why I like the book. And then I'll turn to some comments and a question. So let me talk about the reasons why I like the book. So the first reason I guess you could say is because it is enormously ambitious conceptually or thematically. When I was making notes for the book, I was thinking in terms of, wow, there's this grand narrative here that John is telling in this book. I mean, of course, it is a scholarly examination of Epicurus and Marx and the connections and the relations between those two. But in terms of the concepts and themes that are developed, we get this analysis of starting with the atom, of course, and then moving to the atomic swerve, which then makes possible the formation of the natural world, which then makes possible the formation of human nature, connections of human beings to form communities, social communities, political communities, a conception of natural history and human history is bound up in this. We get a discussion of humanism, socialism, ecology. I mean, it's really stunning if you think about it, that we move, we follow this narrative that takes us from the atom and the atomic swerve to the natural world and eventually to ecology. And I think that is, there's so much packed into this that it is, it's a lot to digest, I think. So the second reason why I like this book is that there are two really interesting and important conceptual puzzles that are kind of at the heart of this book, I would say. First is the question of the atomic swerve and the promise of a naturalistic basis for human free will, which is really interesting. You know, this is where we get materialism and free will brought together. Lots of questions and insights in that. And then secondly, we get the second conceptual puzzle is all of the historical and social implications of and possibilities that emerge from this conception of free will, including ecology. So there's sort of the swerve part and how it contains this promise of human agency or free will. And then secondly, all of the implications, the broader implications, the social, political implications that are bound up with that. And both of those puzzles or questions are really rich with philosophical content, and there are a lot of debates that can take place in those. The third reason why I really liked this book, I mentioned earlier that there's this grand narrative that takes us from the atom to the natural world and to ecology. But there are also a number of smaller narratives that are embedded within this book that make it really interesting to read. So it's an ambitious book, it's philosophically important, but it's also interesting to read. And I think the reason why it's interesting to read is because the way that John kind of tells these different stories, and I'm not going to be able to go into all of them. I want to give three quick examples of these smaller, compelling narratives that make the book interesting to read and also deeply informative, as Boris mentioned. John kind of talked about all of these in his introduction, so I won't go into too much detail here. But the first narrative that I found so interesting and that I learned so much from, because I'm not a scholar on Epicurus or on ancient philosophy, is the story of Epicurus' life, his world, and his influence. So the way that John presents this story, it takes us backwards and forwards in time and in place. You know, it starts out sort of with the pre-Socratic Ionian philosophy. It then moves into the Hellenistic world of Epicurus' own time, the world after the death of Alexander the Great. It takes us to Rome and to the rise of early Christianity. And then it kind of picks up again with the Renaissance and early modernity. And then it's connected through the 19th century with Marx and the influence of Marx's ideas all the way up to the present day, which I think is really interesting. It makes a book fun to read. The second narrative is the story of the atomic swerve. So this story is born in the writings of Epicurus and Lucretius, and the free will argument that emerges there. The story acquires a lot of drama, I think, in the way that these ideas are received in the ancient world and in the early modern world, kind of scholarly philosophical debates about the meaning of the swerve, its implications for human free will. And then it takes on new life in the 19th century with the discovery of these lost Epicurean writings from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And so we've got these new sources and new insights that add additional elements and maybe revelations about the meaning of the atomic swerve and the meaning of the free will that is connected to that. And then, of course, this is also connected to Marx's doctoral dissertation, which takes the swerve as a really central idea and tries to develop that. I think I might agree with Boris's comment that some of Marx's interpretation of the atomic swerve and its implications for conceptions of free will might be coming from Hegel. There's certainly the sort of Hegelian logic that underlies Marx's analysis of that. In the third narrative, embedded narrative, is a story of Marxian materialism. So this is a story that has many components or many chapters, you might say. For John, it originates with Marx's embrace of Epicurean atomism in his dissertation, and then it gets developed in Marx's later works, which John does touch on, if briefly, in his book. What we might call a sensual materialism is influenced by scientific developments and advances in the 19th century. Including Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and other scientific advances. And it's also expressed in the later writings of Engels. What I knew less about, and what I found interesting in the way that John develops this story of Marxian materialism is the way that this is fiercely contested in 20th century Marxism, both in Western interpretations of Marxism and in Soviet interpretations of Marxism. And then how it has acquired new life in the 21st century, perhaps as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union and the way that Marxism has been revisited subsequently to that. And I think the work that John has done and others that are interested in things like Marx's ecology is kind of the latest chapter of the story of Marxian materialism. So all of that to say that I really found the book interesting. I learned a lot from it. It was philosophically rewarding and also interesting to read. Okay, let me move on to some comments and a question. And I think all of this really centers around the conception of freedom that we get from this atomic swerve. So some of what I'm going to say here may echo a little bit what Boris mentioned in his comments. And the way that I would frame this is to make a distinction between what we might call negative freedom and positive freedom. And I think my questions more lie on what I would describe as the sort of the positive freedom, or what we might describe as the implications of the free will that perhaps we do get through Marx's interpretation of the Epicurean swerve. What's clear is that even the title of the book, Breaking the Bonds of Fate, which is, of course, is a phrase that comes from Lucretius and that was taken up by Marx, suggests that we're dealing with a negative conception of freedom here. So that we are not determined, we are not products of necessity, we are not products of fate or fatalism, we are not products of the will of the gods. So those are all ways, so we're free in the sense that we are not determined by those external agencies. But rather we're free in a sense that is akin to autonomy. And that's what is represented or symbolized in the atomic swerve. Now, there's some interesting analytical points here, because I think Marx does, in his interpretation of the atomic swerve, does focus on some, he talks about the role of repulsion in the movement of the atom, and he talks about how the atom in the swerve and in the repulsion from other atoms acquires this form of being for self, which we might say is a form of free will or a form of autonomy that is similar to human free will, human autonomy. And so all of that is really important. But what I guess my questions all revolve around the what we might call the positive freedom that develops or evolves or unfolds from there. So if we just sort of assume for the sake of argument that yes, we do get a legitimate, convincing account of free will that is a naturalistic account because it's connected to nature and to the atom and to the atom. And it has a kind of logical structure to it, as Marx points out. It's the structure of being for self, which turns it into a kind of autonomy. What I'm less clear about is so John uses the phrase eminent dialectic, which he's getting from Marx to describe I guess the logical, the underlying logic of this atomic swerve, the free will that it makes possible, and then whatever else becomes possible, right? The implications or the possibilities that emerge from that immanent dialectic. And my question is, how do the processes that underlie the materialism that we find in Epicurus that leads us to this conception of human free will as symbolized in the atomic swerve, how do those processes lead us to more concrete, more social, more political manifestations? So it's clear enough that what it means to be free is that we're not determined by these external agencies. But it's very clear that Marx and also John want to connect this non-determinism, this freedom, to larger social and political goals. Now, I found it interesting that I drew up a list when I was reading the book of all of the concepts and ideas that are sort of antagonists of John's work and his reading of Epicurus and Marx, and then concepts and terms that are sort of allies or friends of John's interpretation. And one of the concepts that comes up as an antagonist or as an enemy of John's reading is teleology. And so I guess what I'm interested in is understanding better, and maybe this is what John has done in his previous two books, which I haven't read. So that really that may be what I'm asking here, is how all of this develops into something like ecology, or a sustainable society, and so on. So how, if we're talking about an underlying immanent dialectic, which is a kind of process that underlies the conception of nature and atomism and the free will that results from it, how does that lead us to these positive, what I'm calling positive manifestations of freedom that ultimately take us to something like a conception of ecology or a conception of sustainable society? And so I think I will stop there and give John a chance to respond to that. Thank you.
Well, I feel very fortunate to have such an incredible assessment of my book and give me a lot to think about for a very long time. And I hope the listeners are equally enchanted by what Paul had to say. And the central question you raise is negative versus positive freedom. And certainly Marx saw a conception of positive freedom in Epicurus, which is, part of the immanent dialectic. He said that Epicurus had an iron logic, and Marx saw this as a system. Later on, he wrote in the 1850s a letter to Lassalle where he had some doubts about whether he'd read too much into Epicurus's philosophy, seeing it as too systematic, using his own knowledge of dialectics to try to visualize Epicurean philosophy in dialectical terms. But what we now know is that Marx was completely on track, and in fact we have elements. I mean, he knew everything that they had available at the time, but later on there were collections of Epicurus. The Vatican sayings were discovered. The giant sculpture, stone carving of Diogenes of Oenada, and this discovery and retrieval of Epicurean manuscripts from the Herculanean papyri and other sources. So we have a great deal more. And the most important thing is the book 25, the considerable fragments of book 25 of On Nature that we have. And what makes that so interesting is it's on the philosophy of mind. And there's the whole question of materialism and the mind, right? And Epicurus clearly, as David Sedley explains, clearly develops what Marx already recognized was a theory of emergence. And he looks at the mind and he doesn't see it as like determined by atomic motions, but obviously everything depends on the material base. But he sees the mind as developing, uses the notion, what's translated as development or production. With education and experience, the mind develops and emerges at a different level, capable of all sorts of possibilities. And this is really an amazing analysis for in ancient philosophy. But what you see in Epicurus's argument, and it's all through his argument really, is a philosophy of emergence and potential, the negative freedom turning into the possibility of positive freedom, right? So we have to remember that Epicurus, the doctoral dissertation focuses on Epicurus's physics, right? But Marx, just like Epicurus, was ultimately most interested in the ethics. And that comes out more in the notebooks on Epicurean philosophy than it does in the doctoral thesis itself. So Epicurus is using his physics as to create a material basis for ethics. And probably the supreme concept in his ethics, because there's like 7 points on it, and Marx underlines every single one of them, is the concept of justice. And that has to do with reciprocity and restitution, and that's applied both to nature and to human society. And out of that comes a notion of a relation to nature, sustainability, but also comes out of it the notion of the social contract, not in the sense that Hobbes and Locke later used it, but in the original Epicurean sense of a compact that actually merged in a process of historical struggle. So you have, I don't know how to explain this, but this notion of emergence, there's also, as Marx and both Hegel and Marx emphasize, that the role of self-consciousness, the development of self-consciousness, which is evident in Epicurus's critique of religion. So you have self-consciousness, you have human development, you have the emergence of social individuals, notions of sustainability, which is really about restitution, reciprocity, justice as equality, and Epicurus argues that justice isn't fixed, that it changes with the historical conditions. He actually argues that, and Marx used that argument in his own trial, from which where he was acquitted. But he uses Epicurus's argument to defend himself when he's on trial for the Rheinische Zeitung. So but there is this, the whole analysis points, it swerves into human freedom, emergence, sustainability, reciprocity, community, friendship, equality. That's where the analysis all goes. And I think that probably one can get lost in the physics and not realize, what Epicurean philosophy is all about. But it had material foundations for this positive vision, and I think that's really what's important. I don't know. Your question was so big. I hope I've got halfway to answering it.
Great. Thank you so much. I know that Boris has to leave at 1:20. So I want to take an opportunity to thank both Boris and Paul for being respondents here. We turn now to questions from the audience. So if anybody who's watching, if you have a question, please drop it in the chat. And I think, do we have?
Yeah, you can cut your sound. Thank you all for that rich conversation. There is a question from the chat. Feel your audio, Jen. Which is, sorry, doesn't Epicurus directly criticize the dialecticians of his own time? How can we reconcile that with Marx's claim that there's an immanent dialectic in his philosophy? This is from Jordan online. There's also another question from Ryan, which is what insights do you think this work has for the problem of historical agency in the face of the climate crisis, where fatalism is a response? I'm thinking of your 2011 theory course. And John, is that enough to start? I had an additional question, but that might be enough for.
Okay. Well,
Go ahead. I think you're muted.
I am. No, I'm not muted. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you,
Okay.
so yeah, it should be fine.
Oh, okay. All right. So, in terms of dialectics, of course, dialectics is not can take different forms, and we have many versions of the application of dialectics. Plato and Hegel are examples. Marx is an example, but Marx believed that Epicurus had an immanent dialectics, and this is very important because in Marx's time, dialectics was completely associated with idealism. And for him to contend that a materialist theorist, a clearly materialist theorist, could be dialectical was very important. And one of the things that Paul mentioned was teleology as something that Epicureanism was opposed to. It rejected final causes. It rejected all idealist notions of dialectics and tried to find, develop what Marx saw clearly as a dialectical view that came from materialist foundations and relied very much on the concept of emergence. So I don't think that's a problem. You said he criticized dialecticians in his time, like or the Epicureans did, and that's true. They criticized the idealists and the skeptics, and in Epicurus's time, The conflict with the Stoics came later in Roman times, but they they were presenting a different version of dialectics. Was like Clotes said to Plutarch, Clotes wrote in criticizing Socrates that Socrates thinks you eat food by putting it in your ear rather than putting in your mouth. That his philosophy doesn't recognize that you have to put food in your mouth. That was a way of saying Socrates' philosophy is not sufficiently materialistic. And there is a dialectical critique there that needs to be advanced. So in terms of the second question, historical agency in our time, I think that it's well recognized nowadays that Epicurean philosophy, which focused on needs, critiqued, provided critique of acquisition as the goal of life, and emphasized sustainability, community, society based on friendship, or we often forget in the French triad, liberty, equality, and fraternity. We often forget fraternity, which is comradeship, right? And this was, these are things, the emphasis on substantive equality, on freedom, on women being equal with men, on reciprocity with nature, on justice as involving reciprocal relations, all of these things, and maybe even be able to create sustainable communities in defense of in a time of an empire of chaos. That was Samir Amin's phrase, but I think it has a larger application. This is all really embedded in Epicureanism, and maybe Marxists need to find a way to relate to that. Once again, we have new challenges. There is an ecological perspective that emerges here that's fundamental, and a respect for nature and science. So it's a way of retrieving things and broadening our own perspective, not becoming Epicureans because we're not living in the 3rd century BC, but learning from it. And maybe Marxism has become too idealist. Maybe Marxism has become too productivist. And so maybe we need to retrieve these viewpoints. And I guess the question came from somebody in my 2011 class, which is nice.
Yeah, I'm just going to maybe to wrap up, John. This is such a rich book, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the ways in which it elucidates how dialectical and historical materialists should approach something like the history of philosophy, which has been dominated really by kind of bourgeois historians of philosophy who analyze ideas in the abstract and a kind of ethereal conversation that the great thinkers have had across the ages. Or if it does engage in contextualization, it tends to be a form of contextualization that is not situated in a materialist analysis of economic modes of production and class warfare and things along these lines. So what methodological tools do you find your book kind of brings to the forward, or brings to the fore? And as a kind of follow-up to that too, I'm curious because in reading the work, it looks like one of the things that you're interested in is a kind of semi-autonomy of the superstructure, because you're dealing with a figure, Epicurus, who worked in, an ancient slave society, and yet you're teasing out the influence on someone who was working primarily in the 19th century. And so I kept thinking about Lenin's incredible thesis on the three sources and component parts of Marxism. But what Lenin draws on is the way that Marx was really synthesizing kind of German classical philosophy, the political economy coming out of England, and then the French utopian socialists. So these were all within the same historical conjuncture. What you're saying is that no, there's another kind of source and component of this deep, deep materialist tradition, and it actually comes from an ancient slave society and Epicurus working within it. And so it's an interesting way of thinking about the history of ideas, their material histories, but then also the rich resources that preceded really the modern historical conjuncture of capitalism and fed into the philosophy of Marx and Engels. So I was curious if you could just share with us a little bit of your kind of methodologies for understanding a more materialist history of ideas, if you will.
Yeah, Marx said in his notebooks on Epicurean philosophy that he was using a genetic method, right? And for him, that meant really a historical method. I mean, focusing on the genealogy of ideas. And I think my method is very historical materialist. In philosophy, we usually treat ideas as if they fall from the skies, right? That's a criticism you can find in Aristophanes or Epicurus, that we ignore the historical material background. We ignore natural conditions. Philosophy is often removed from that. We ignore the struggles that took place, the context in which something was written. And so it was very important for me in understanding this all, not to simply try to go back to Epicurus's philosophy straight out, as I more or less did in Marx's Ecology, but to go to research as much as possible all of the historical material foundations to contextualize things in the only way you can really understand. And that's a historical materialist method, but the historical materialist method is far superior to how philosophy is generally approached and taught, because it's taught in a vacuum, and we don't, and that produces incredible illusions and misinterpretations. Like the notion that Epicurus was an idealist, which, we could only do if you not only didn't know the history, but you didn't know the philosophy itself. But we treat ideas as abstractions. So that's a large part of the method. And I'm forgetting the second part of your question, which was even more interesting. But again, quite grasp it. Let me see if I can.
It was just about how your work relates to Lenin's thesis on the three sources and component parts.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
as well, he's dealing with the immediate material conjuncture out of which Marx was kind of synthesizing things. But you're saying, no, wait, there's also this earlier materialist tradition that had an impact on Marx, but coming from a superstructural formation that was very, very different than the immediate context
Yeah.
within which Marx was working.
Well, Marx had other influences than the ones that Lenin mentioned. I mean, Lenin's summary was good, but if you look at French socialism at the time, Marx mentions French socialists in his dissertation. He's already looking at French socialist followers of Epicurus. So, I mean, the French socialists all came right out, Lemaitre and so on. They all came directly out of Epicurus, although they tended to interpret it in very mechanistic terms. So Marx is, in exploring French socialism, he's driven back to Epicurus. In terms of German philosophy, it's it's really not understood that how important Hegel's history of philosophy was to Marx. I mean, we tend to focus on certain texts like the Phenomenology or the Logic and ignore Hegel's history of philosophy, which Marx studied voraciously. And, he was looking at, what Hegel said about Epicurus, for example, and contesting it, right? So, German idealist philosophy was involved in this, but it's also true that Feuerbach, in his first great work, The History of Modern Philosophy, which nobody reads, it was all about materialist thinkers, starting with Bacon. And there's a whole chapter on Gassendi, which is all about Epicurus. It's all about Gassendi's interpretation of Epicurus, because that's what Gassendi was. That's what his philosophy was. And Feuerbach took from that the notion of a sensuous materialism. And Marx read that when he read his dissertation, and it's referenced in his dissertation. And Marx and Feuerbach end up moving in very similar directions that were both heavily influenced by Epicurus. So it's more complicated than what Lenin said, right? You could, as Diego Fusaro and others have said, that there's now four sources of Marxist thought, and Epicurean Marx materialism would have to be one of those. And that's one way we're looking at it. But another way of looking at it is just how Marx was influenced by, that in looking at French socialism and looking at German idealism and looking at natural science, which Lenin didn't include, but actually was very important for Marx. It's all, thinkers like Bacon. It's all very, very heavily laced by Epicureanism, which was extremely influential. So it's there. Whether you look at it directly or indirectly, it was. And you have to remember that the first two philosophers that Marx ever mentioned were Plato and Epicurus. And he took the side of Plato over Epicurus, but at that time it was in a school paper. But it may have been disingenuous. There's different theories of that. But the thing is, he was thinking about Epicurus, and Epicurus was the most interesting part of it. He was thinking about Epicurus's critique of religion, and Marx's atheism really came out of the Epicurean critique. So it's just there, and I don't know if we could formulate everything differently, but everything that Marx took seriously had, really as an answer was materialism. Even in looking at Hegel's dialectics actually, in some ways, you stand it on its feet and you get a materialist view. And so Marx was capable of reading materialism into Hegel, not Hegel's philosophy straightforward, but he was able to turn Hegel upside down or put him on his feet on a materialist basis, and then have all sorts of insights that allowed him to put forward his own notion of dialectics. I don't know if this answers the question of method, but I think, the method is a historical method. Not why? How come nobody who's writing about Feuerbach mentions the fact that he got his notion of sensuous materialism from Gassendi and Epicurus? And you know how influential that was on Marx, right? So there's depth there, and we can we can do an archaeological dig and come up with new knowledge, new artifacts, as in a sense that allow us to expand our own critical vision, understand the development of thought, understand maybe what was missing, left behind, forgotten, and it can give us clues to our own struggles in our own time. But we have to focus on those struggles. So I'm involved in the struggles over ecology and in the present in historical materialist, you could say dialectical materialist terms. But the more critical tools we have, I think the more effective we can be in understanding and engaging in praxis.
I think that's an excellent point to close on. Thank you so much, John, for this incredibly rich discussion today. Thank you again, Paul, and thanks to Boris for your excellent comments. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. Okay, take care, everyone. Thank you. Oh, John, do you have any final comments?
Only that I would like to thank all of you, Paul and Boris and Gabriel and you, Jennifer, and for making this possible and actually believing that this work is important, important for the critical theory workshop, important for Marxism, because I've always been afraid that people might think that this is kind of an esoteric investigation, that why would Marxists be interested in ancient Greece or ancient Greek materialism? And I'm hoping that people can see why it's important and why we can build a better, more critical, more powerful, more meaningful, more practical tradition, allowing us to engage in the struggle for freedom and sustainability and equality in our time. And also, I think that sometimes we forget about things like talking about human freedom. We talk too much in terms of big abstractions. We need a way of talking about things that really communicates with people where they are. And so this is all part of an effort in that respect. Anyway, I thank you all, and I thank you for believing in this enough to set up this critical theory workshop. And I invite people to continue to come to the critical theory workshop.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all again for being here today.
Okay, the live stream